Welcome to another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me as always is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
I am doing okay, but we have to say that as we're sitting down to record this, we were just given the news that Steve Albini has passed away.
Yes.
At age 61. Very, very young guy, obviously very influential in the field and by all accounts, a real stand-up guy. So unfortunately, he has passed away and left us.
Let's take one moment of silence before we kick into today's episode. What are we talking about today, Chris?
Today, we are discussing a couple of ways to get depth with your guitar recordings.
Mm-hmm.
For me, coming from more of a rock and metal background, it is very tempting to, once you have a great guitar tone on your rhythm guitar, I'm talking now, to just duplicate that and do the same thing as you're double tracking. It's not always the best way to go about it. This is something that you're a big proponent of, have always kind of done, but then again, you haven't necessarily been waist deep into sort of like the metal world, at least not recently.
I haven't been waist deep in that in terms of that. However, I have done a lot of double, triple, sometimes even quadruple tracking of guitars. And sometimes it works well. But early on, when I was learning how to do this stuff, it didn't work well. And there were primary reasons for that. There's a multitude of ways to do it, and the ways that I was initially attempting to do it were horrifically bad, is a good way of saying it.
Horrifically bad even.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's say that you're relatively new, you have a simple setup.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that you're micing a cab, and you manage to get a good tone out of that.
Yes.
It's like, yay, cool, we got it. Let's start tracking. Let's double tracking. Let's triple, and like you said, quadruple tracking.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're really doing at that point is you're just making the guitars louder because it's the same thing. It's not a whole lot of nuance. It doesn't have to be drastic changes to the tone to get the results that we can go after.
True.
If you just have like the one amp, or even if you just have one mic, you can still employ some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. We obviously have to consider that musical stylings here will have a great influence on all of this.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing something that's really guitar heavy, you might get more mileage out of it. But if you're doing like a pop track or something, you're unlikely to have an identical guitar part just doubled up. It's going to be something completely different or complementary parts. So you're dealing with that as well, and you're very likely, at least in my opinion, to have a different tone doing that kind of stuff.
I don't disagree.
Good. So, but let's say that you're doing something where you want, we want a wall of guitars here. You're doing like a freaking Rammstein track or whatever. You're doing something really heavy. Mm-hmm. There are a few things that we can do.
Correct.
Like I said, slight variations are sometimes just enough. If we start with that hypothetical scenario when we have just the one amp, we got one mic on a cab, and we're relatively happy with the results that we're getting. Mm-hmm. The first thing I would do if I want to do something is just slightly mess with the amp, obviously, with the amp settings.
Okay. And this is assuming that you're going to leave the mic in the same spot then.
Yes. I'm going as simple as that first. That would be another option, right? We can start moving the mic around, right? But even if we have that, or, change the cabinet, all that kind of stuff that we could do, I would start playing with EQ and possibly the gain as well. Let's say that you're thinking of this in a way that one is going to be a little bit more focused on the low end, perhaps. And the other one will be whatever it'll be, like a good all-round tone. You might add a little bit more low end or take off a little bit more low end on the supporting guitar. Conversely, just playing where the other one isn't. No, I'm not playing with as physically playing the instrument, but playing with the sound. Mm-hmm. You might boost a little bit more of the mids. You might add a little bit more top. You might go the reverse. But just playing with the sound where it's different enough that it sounds like two guitars. That's the immediate thing to go with first.
So your first point is two different EQ settings, one for each track.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they don't have to be drastic because you don't want to be so different that it starts falling apart. Like it's different, but it's just a bad tone now, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So it's one of those things where you just, you know what, let's just add a little bit more mids here or take off some low end or whatever it happens to be. Just something that's going to work in the track, obviously.
Yep.
Very arrangement dependent, of course, but.
Well, the other thing you mentioned along with the EQ is messing around with the gain. And one of the things that I find super interesting, a bunch of years ago when Korn came out, everybody thought they were extremely heavy, super heavy. But their guitar tone, in reality, is not mega distorted. It's actually quite clean for a heavy guitar sound. There was an interview with, I'm assuming, Monkey or the other guitar player, I don't know the names of both of them, where they were talking about how they were getting their quote-unquote heavy guitar tone. And they learned in the studio that you didn't need to crank the gain in order to get heavy. In fact, they were saying the more distortion they added, the less heavy it sounded.
Yeah.
So they would dial their amps back in terms of the amount of gain. And I think it also had to do with the fact that they were layering guitars. So when you are working with the gain, a single guitar might sound super cool with a blinding amount of gain. But as soon as you layer guitars and you layer multiple guitars with a blinding amount of gain, they're just going to become a soupy mess a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So changing the gain structure is a big deal. And it seems counterintuitive, but it's not.
I was going to say that something that we have talked about, or at least mentioned in the past. You want to have enough gain where it's appropriate for what it is that you're doing, right? But once you start going beyond that, where, especially when you start layering stuff, it just turns to mush and you lose that definition. So the example that you bring up, the Korn, yeah, they're distorted guitars, but the heaviness, I think, comes from not only were they, using 7 strings and kind of popularizing those in the metal realm or rock realm or new metal or whatever the fuck you want to call it. It comes from a lot more areas than just amounts of distortion. That's a good lesson to take away from there, especially when you're recording. And I know there was something that John Petrucci from Dream Theater had mentioned in an interview as well, where he would set the distortion such that once it started to just kind of really break up and lose all definition, he would dial that back a little bit and know, okay, here's a good spot. Right, so you get the heaviness of the tone that you want, but it is oftentimes less distortion than you might think to get that across. A great example for that as well is not necessarily metal, but when you think about AC/DC and you think of Malcolm Young's guitar tone, how that is so complementary of Angus, that is a little bit dirtier there. But Malcolm's tone used to be pretty much almost clean, but it doesn't sound like, oh, okay, we're playing jazz guitar here through scratch, right? It has enough cajones, right, where it's all about the attitude there.
Right. And a third portion to this of keeping the same amp and attempting to change EQ and or gain is the mic component.
Yeah.
Where you mic the speaker can change the sound pretty drastically without having to touch the EQ knobs or the gain knob per se.
Yeah.
In that, if you're miking right up on the cone or the cap and you're on the grill, well, you're not getting a lot of room sound, so that's not really changing anything, but it's definitely giving you a bump in the low end because of a proximity effect. Now, if you pull the mic directly back from where you were 3-4 inches, it's going to be a lot less low-endy and a lot less guttural in the sense that the mic is not right up on the speaker or the grill, so to speak. So that's another way to change the guitar tone without touching the amp even, is to just change the location of the mic. Mind you, if you're tracking over the course of multiple days, it's probably not the wisest idea. Because if you have to go back and say, oh, wow, we need to punch in on this particular part, but the mic was in a different spot. Well, now moving the mic back to that spot isn't necessarily going to get you the exact same sound, because even being a millimeter off is going to change it in some way or shape or form. The idea is don't move the mic until you are completely ready to change for an entirely different tone. That would be my suggestion on that. Those are the three ways to kind of keep the amp the same and change the sound in little ways that can get you your second track in a different sense.
Right. Another thing would be, though, even if we have the same setup, would be if we had a second guitar, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Similar guitar, I would say, if you're going for that ballpark, it might be still a humbucker kind of tone that you're going for. If you have another one, just that as well brings another dimension to the sound.
Right.
That sounds so obvious when you bring it up, but it's like, if you have a second guitar, but don't go with, I'm going to lay down these chunky guitars with my Les Paul type of guitar, and then I'll go, oh, you know what? I'll just use my Gretsch here. Unless you're AC/DC, of course, then that works just fine.
Right.
Appropriate choices there. Next thing, let's say that you have a second amp. Mm-hmm. Ta-da! Obviously, simple choice, right?
Easy choice,
but I would go again, though, here with the mindset of, if you had what you hear in your head as an idealized tone with a first amp, try to get something similar with the next amp, but by the sheer fact that it's going to be a different amplifier, it's going to sound slightly different. So that's another way to go as well. If you're still aiming for that bullseye type of a thing, use a different amp and see what kind of dimension that could bring.
By the same token, if you get a signal splitter of some sort and you play the guitar into that and then run that split into both amps and mic them at the same time, while it's not the same thing as double tracking a guitar with two different takes of the playing, it will get you a wider sound because you're using two different setups. The problem with that, though, is you got to make sure that they complement each other when they fold down into mono. Otherwise, you will lose a lot of sound in mono. And that's where I said the terrible reality of what I was originally doing sometimes was attempting to do the 2 amp setup as a stereo or double track thing, and it didn't work well folding down to mono.
That is a really interesting technique. The way I would approach it, though, would be that I would think of that as the same source, if you will. I wouldn't necessarily pan those hard left and hard right or whatever, right? I would kind of think of them as just one tone and layer and sort of play between those 2 amp tones, much as you could do if you had multiple mics, that type of a thing.
Right.
But it is an interesting thing as well. If you're going for that girth of a performance, it is the playing it like the second time and those slight discrepancies that you would get in the performance.
Oh, yeah.
Keyword there being slight.
Yes. Provided you can play that perfectly, so to speak.
Yeah, this is true.
Now, one thing that makes it easier to work with multiple amps is if you're using amp sims.
Oh, yeah.
You can easily switch out amps at a much cheaper rate than buying a whole bunch of hardware amps. Or
you don't say.
Or if you're really inclined, you could go rent a bunch of amps, which is something some people do. Or they borrow them, beg, borrow, and steal. There's a famous guitar player that is known to borrow an amp while they're recording and then give it back to their buddy or whoever they borrowed it from. Sometimes they like it so much they don't give it back, and that's a problem too. So don't get into that one.
Well, it depends on if you're the loaner or the loanee,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Obviously, the tips that we're talking about here, it's ridiculously easier if you're in the box, right? But the same idea goes, and there are guys and guitar players notoriously always go, oh, they don't feel the same when I play them. I need to mic up my amp in a room and be in the room as you're playing in. That's all fine. If that's what you want to do, great. So much of what we hear and in the past has been done that way. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Today, with the convenience that we have of amp sims that are so good, in my opinion, the flexibility is just
ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. So it's so good. If we are in the hardware world and we don't have a second amp, we don't have somebody to borrow it from or rent from or whatever. Another thing would be to just simply like throw a pedal in front of the amp.
You mean a stomp box of some sort?
Yeah. So thinking like a tube screamer or something that will just change your tone slightly. That's give enough and still play with EQ, doing all of these things that you could do. But if you have tube scream, or if you have a Klon, or if you have an old Boss SD1 or whatever, put that puppy in front of there.
The MT1, man, come on. You're a metal guy.
yeah, right? Just everything maximum. Wasn't that the Scandinavian death metal sound? I think it was just like a metal zone and everything just turned up maximum. I think that's what it was.
Might be.
So if you want to sound like a buzzsaw,
go for it.
Have at it. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned mics there a little while ago. What's your favorite mic? What's the first mic that you ended up pulling out?
SM57 Beta.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people like the SM57, but I happen to have a Beta and I happen to like the way it works. So I use the 57 Beta first.
Yeah, I would say that it's the most versatile mic ever.
The 57, you're saying?
Yeah, the 57. Yeah, I mean, you could use it on anything. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a guitar recording that doesn't have a 57 on it. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but,
it is,
but if you only have one mic, we've said it before, get a 57. That's like, what, $100, and you can do
Can't beat the price, and the things are as reliable as a tank.
Yeah,
or
definitely.
Most tanks, anyway.
Absolutely. And they take the abuse, yeah.
That they do.
The choices for me is I like Sennheiser 421.
Yep.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention like a ribbon mic, like a Royer 121.
Yep.
Like those are what I consider like the big three, right?
What was your first mic that you had?
A 57.
So you had a 57 as your first mic?
Yeah. Yep. And I still have it and a lot of mileage out of it.
What was your second mic?
The second mic I ever got was not for guitar, but I think I got cheap like Octava mic, something that I was going to do some vocals with or whatever.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't a great mic, but it got the job done. And I whatever it was I was looking for at the time, I'm like, okay, well, that fits the budget. I think it's got like $419. Yeah, I think it was under $200. It was probably way less than that. So, yeah. What about you? What was the second one you got? You got the Groove Tubes, yeah?
Yes. So my first mic was an SM57 Beta, and I still have it. Thing still works like the day I got it. It's a workhorse, so to speak. My second mic that I got was a Groove Tubes MD1A, which is a tube microphone. It is a condenser mic. Very, very different, vastly different in its build and makeup and its sonic quality as well. The interesting thing about the MD1A is it's been used on a variety of different things, much like the 57 has been. It wasn't specifically that I got it for vocals, but I certainly used it for that, and I still use it for that. I have mic'd guitar cabinets with it. I've mic'd drums with it. I've mic'd all kinds of things with the Groove Tubes MD1A. I have to take care of it at this point. They don't make them anymore. So I do need to be relatively careful with it. It is a very nice microphone.
Perhaps don't put it in front of a blasting guitar cab, right? Be a little nice to it. Yeah.
So that was my second mic right there. And I have used it to blend with the 57 Beta and other mics when I'm miking things up. And it gives a much darker tone. It's not a very bright mic. It's a more even keel, darker mic.
Before we leave the mic thing here, I'm curious because of that, the Groove Tubes mic, how far back would you normally put that then? Because I imagine that wouldn't be very close up to the grill, or did you get really aggressive with it?
I've done it all kinds of ways when it comes to guitars. When I mentioned the terrible guitar tone by using a splitter and running multiple things to cabinets and running two mics and stuff to get a quote-unquote thicker sound, it was actually with two of the Groove Tubes MD1As doing that. That was my early on experience of being ignorant.
Too clever for your own good.
Well, no, just being ignorant is really what it is. Having not really learned about that and nobody saying, hey, don't do that. So I was borrowing my roommate's MD1A while I had my MD1A and miking 2 different guitar setups to do it, to try and create this wider, bigger guitar sound. It sounded great if it was full left, right, hard pan. Folding it to mono, half the guitar sound would disappear. Because I didn't know enough about different distances and other things and whatnot. So it came out sounding terrible in mono.
Yeah.
That's why I say if you're going to use 2 separate setups with a singular guitar to kind of create a wide sound, check it in mono to make sure it folds down well. If it doesn't, you're screwed later if you don't check it up front.
Yeah. But as I told you before, it's like in your defense, when you were doing these recordings, not only were you relatively new to recording, but also folding down to
Mono was not
probably
a big
something
deal.
that's like, I was like, who's going to listen to it that way? But of course, today with phones and home pods and all this kind of stuff, it's an actual reality thing.
It is.
So
It used to be a reality, then it wasn't, and now it is again. Damn it.
yeah, it's kind of crazy.
It is.
Kind of crazy. When it comes to the multi-mic thing, I would say it's fun to experiment with to do different things. But some players imagine that they want more mics on their cabinet than they're actually needed.
Oh, of course.
I know I've done recordings with people and that, I want these on the cabinets. But then come mix down time, it's like, okay, I'm not going to use those, just going to use the 57, right? If they're not adding something
or complementing something from one mic to another. And that also comes down to a mix stage thing where if you have multiple mics, you're probably not running them all at 0, so to speak, to hear everything all at once. There's going to be a blend of that sound to create the sound. What's the most mics you've ever used on a cabinet?
I'm not sure if I ever have used more than 2, to be honest.
The most I've tried is 3.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's asking for trouble because of the phase
phasing
and all
issues and all that kind of stuff. So it really becomes, when you start to multi-mic in that way, chances are you're going to treat them all in mono to create a singular sound rather than trying to pan them out and have like one mic left, one mic right, and one mic center. It's not going to work the same way. So once you go beyond trying to split a signal to get a hard left, hard right, you're probably doing multiple mics to a mono portion of the mix.
An even more common thing also as well, certainly in the metal world, is to actually have 2 57s, but you do one straight on and you do one off axis and just kind of blend that as well, just to have more of a palette again. But a lot of guys that do that, they often know what they're doing and have taken care of phase relation and all this kind of stuff as well.
Right. Beyond that, we mentioned some amp sims, and there are some things that you can do with the amp sims if you're not going to change the particular guitar or the amp head that you're using. For another in-the-box solution, you can change the impulse response or the cabinet that you're running behind that amp, and that will change things.
Much easier in the box than it is in real life.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. And obviously the same things. I mean, I'm a big fan of a few. I mean, I like the Brainworks plug in the line stuff. I really like the Neural DSP stuff. As I've said before, I have an amp sim problem, but I'm dealing with it. There, you oftentimes have a load of choices. Different IRs to choose from. Sometimes it's, I want the sound again. I don't want to dial the knobs. This is my preset. This is what I got. Using another IR is a simple way to do that. And get a little bit more depth as well.
For sure.
The last one I would mention, though, is if you're getting tracks and receiving tracks that have all been recorded, so there's no way of actually changing anything right now. One thing that you can do besides obviously like EQing them differently would be use a different console emulation of, in your mix session. Yeah, it'd be very subtle. Again, it could be like if you know that you're going to have a certain boost at a certain frequency or changing to a different band of the SSL might do the job or whatever. So there are things that we can do, but just bottom line, I think, is just to create some differences between the tone, even if they're in the same ballpark, and that will give you more depth.
For sure. With that, we'll move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got this week?
Well, I got excited news today because it was the Apple thing yesterday, right? And they announced, because I know that they did because you texted me.
Yes.
Logic 2, but it's for iPad. But they've actually announced the new update. I'm not sure if this is going to be called Logic 11 or whatever. It will be my Friday find this week, that's for sure. There's a couple of things that I find more interesting in it, and that's what they call session players. They have essentially, it's like the tune track route, right? They have a virtual bass player and a virtual keyboard player that's part of it, much in the way that the drummer has been. So I'm kind of excited to see what that's going to bring. I have
probably a whole lot of homogenous music that sounds the same across a whole lot of people.
There's always
that chance right there. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's what you do with it. It's a tool, right? And just like the drummer in Logic, it sometimes spits out an idea that's, that's kind of cool. I wouldn't have thought of that. And then you take that and run with it. Yeah, there will be cases where it's like, okay, here's so-and-so session player on preset 4. Yay! We haven't heard that before, right? Still worthy of a Friday find. What do you got, Jody?
I'm going with something that's been around for a minute. It's Machine 2 from Native Instruments. The reason why is I was asked to create something yesterday, and I was thinking about what's the best route that I should take with this. And I realized I have everything that Native Instruments has done. Why don't I explore that? And I was rather taken aback at the sheer depth of things that I could do within Machine 2. Was it easy? Not based on my normal workflow, but did I get something done and have it sound cool? Yes. And that is why I'm going with Machine 2 by Native Instruments.
Very cool.
While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. You'll need to be on our email list to be eligible for future giveaways, and we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of this awesome podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word tone, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Have a good one, Jody. Thanks for listening, everybody.